Hi there, and welcome to this Sakai virtual conference presentation. My name's Lucy Tallents. I'm a freelance and visiting academic at the University of Oxford. I worked with Sakai in Oxford, where we call it WebLearn, for quite a few years. And now I am launching out into a freelance career, but still very keen to use Sakai as much as I can and to benefit from the really valuable community, the really friendly and helpful community that's built up around this open source software. So I'm going to be juggling the chat window. I'm going to be moving between a set of slides on open collaborative authoring and also my WebLearn page, just to show you how things appear within Sakai. You are very welcome. At present, you're muted. You are very welcome to unmute yourself if you would like to ask questions. You can also type them in the chat room, and I will try and keep an eye on the chat room on my other screen. But every now and then I put a reminder to myself in the slides to check the chat room. So hopefully if you have any questions, if I don't spot them and answer them immediately, then at least I will get to them at various points in the talk. So I'm hoping that this talk will not take the whole time, because I think it's important to give you guys a chance to ask questions or to give me your comments. I'm really hoping that I'll get some reaction from you as well on this talk. So I wanted you to be able to see my face, but because it's distracting to me to have my face right there, I'm going to switch off the webcam now. Okay, so we'll make a start. So first of all, the structure of this talk. First of all, I'd like to tell you about why I'm changing the way that I create courses and the way that I integrate them within Sakai. I explain to you why I'm so keen on using plain text for the creation of my courses, and give you a little window into what my content creation workflow is, in case that helps stimulate any ideas for you about how you or your colleagues might want to change the way that you work with course content creation. And then how all of the text files that I create, I integrate them within Sakai. Tell you a few of the lessons that I've learned during this process of the last few months, and then talk about the way I see this working for me in the future and the directions in which I'd like to move in the future. So the way I used to write courses up until sometime this summer was that I would write the learning materials in Microsoft Word, and then I would copy and paste them into various Sakai tools, so the lessons tool, tests, surveys, quizzes, polls, all of the usual candidates that I'm sure a lot of you use. And then I would use the additional functionality of the lessons tool to add structure to help my students navigate through a bit more of a learning pathway by using subpages in lessons and by using questions to get them to stop and reflect on what it is that they're learning. And then I would follow that up by editing the final version within the lessons tool, because there's inevitably things that you change when you see how it looks on the screen and when you see how your students are beginning to interact with the learning materials. But one of the problems with this is that the end result is that most up-to-date version of my course was in Sakai, and that made it a lot harder to export in editable form. And I'll explain why in a minute, how that's important to me to be able to export and reuse the content, sometimes outside of Sakai. So there are various reasons why I wanted to try and do things differently. In particular, now that I'm launching into a freelance career, there's the possibility that I'll need to deploy courses in multiple virtual learning environments, and I can't really afford for the final version to be locked away into a single VLE. I want to be able to edit everything. I want to make changes in a single place, so not necessarily have various edits that are happening in individual tools, in the lessons tool, in the surveys tool in Sakai, but just one place, one folder on my computer where all of the text, all of the learning materials are gathered, and where I can update them, and where that will then automatically propagate changes across my course sites in Sakai or elsewhere. I'm also beginning to collaborate more on designing courses and learning activities. And this is a fantastic process. I'm really enjoying it. I've wanted to do it for a long time, and I'm really lucky to have found people now who want to build courses with me. But this creates its own challenges, because we obviously need to be able to share editing. Sometimes the people I collaborate with are not in the same institution as me, and they're not allowed to have the same kind of editing rights on Sakai that I have. So I need to find a way for us to collaboratively create materials outside of Sakai. And I also have an aspiration in the future that perhaps once I've started earning enough money through my paid courses, I can start creating open course materials that I can share with the wider world. A bit of background on myself: I work in wildlife conservation, and there's a real dearth of resources for training and capacity building. So the more that we can use open source software and open source learning materials, the more that we can share what we do, the more likely we'll have a real impact on conservation and on the ground. I also had a problem, which I think is common to people who work with coding and do a lot of writing, do a lot of point and click work on their computers, is that I began developing mouse-related repetitive strain injury. And whilst I made a few changes to my work practices and a few changes to the way my desk is laid out, it still wasn't really getting any better. And I knew that I really had to find a new way to interact with and create my learning materials that didn't require so much pointing and clicking and working with these graphical user interfaces, but that allowed me to do more just with text, with programmatic file creation, so writing scripts using programming code in order to do file conversions, and also allowed me to do more voice recognition for my writing. And as I said earlier, I'm really keen to use open source software in general, and I'm challenging myself to use open source software for all stages of course creation and teaching, not just the bit where the students interact with the learning materials through Sakai. So my new approach, the base system, is plain text authoring, which I write in Markdown, and that's a markup style that I will demonstrate to you in a minute. And then they're converted into HTML. So using this system, I create text to go on the Sakai lessons pages. I create slides, such as the ones you're looking at right now. These are created entirely in plain text files, no dragging and dropping and clicking and changing formatting through menus, just in plain text. I create activity instructions, so more detailed instructions for the students on how to interact with the software, how to interact with each other in different kinds of learning activities. My history is mainly working with online-only courses, but these days as a freelancer, I'm doing much more face-to-face work, and I'm also experimenting with flipped learning. And I also want to create test questions in plain text form. Because I'm working with collaborators, I need some way of having version control, so that if they and I are editing the same document, we need to make sure that that document always contains the most up-to-date edits from each of us, and that if there is any kind of conflict, we have a way of sorting out which is the most recent version and not losing any of the good work that myself or my collaborators are doing. And then I embed these files into the lessons tool, or I link to these HTML files from within the lessons tool. So I'm a real advocate of the lessons tool. I think it's fantastic for being able to bring materials together, for being able to direct students through learning activities and give them feedback, all from within a single platform that doesn't require them to keep navigating and trying to remember where they were in the different activities and in the different tools. So now a little bit about why plain text. Oh, and I'm afraid my little meme of plain text, all the things, is not showing up here, but never mind. I want to use plain text because it's both human readable and it's machine readable. And I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by those two things. So plain text is human readable, and as I mentioned, I use Markdown, which is a markup language, which is very lightweight, very quick and easy to learn, and you use text tags for formatting rather than doing point and click or keyboard shortcuts. So here you can see, that image is not showing either. I'll have a think about that, and I will come back to that at the end. I'll try and fix that so that you can see that. If I could just check if any of you do see an image rather than just the line that says atom highlighting at the bottom of that slide, if you could stick up your hand in case it's something strange in the way that I'm viewing it. Okay, thanks for the confirmation. You can't see it. Never mind. I will try that later. I'll find a way to display it on the screen. And the other important thing is that the plain text is machine readable. And this means that it's compatible with any operating system. I recently switched to using Ubuntu, but it doesn't matter. My files on my Windows machine that I create in plain text, I don't need to install special software in order to be able to read and edit them on my Ubuntu machine. Plain text is also can be read by any virtual learning environment. So HTML is also a type of plain text that uses tags in order that the VLE can interpret how it should format different things. And plain text is compatible with any text editor, so that you can have completely your free choice of text editor. You're not stuck in using a particular commercial proprietary software in order to read and edit your files. And when you're working with multiple collaborators who work on different operating systems and have their own preferred editing workflows, then they can also bring the plain text files into that and edit them in their own preferred way. And you can also view these files using an intelligent text editor, which allows you to highlight them, and that will become more clear when I show you the image that was missing from the previous slide. So it's possible to embed images, to insert URLs, and to find and replace text across multiple files simultaneously, which is something that I can't do very easily in a Word document. I use version control with GitHub, a GitHub repository in Git. I know this is all quite technical, but there are elements, if any of you are interested in adopting any of these ideas, there are different, you don't have to do the whole workflow, you can adopt different elements. I didn't find Git very difficult to learn. There is a little bit of learning needs to take place at the beginning, but it has a lot of capabilities that you don't need to learn in order to use it effectively with some collaborators. So, okay, I'll just look in the chat window as a reminder to me. I don't see any questions so far. So my diagram that I created using plain text and mermaids is also not showing up. Okay, that's disappointing. I'm sorry about that. It would be nice to show you that. But it was a visual basically of how my workflow is organized, the different software that I use. And what I'll do is, what you can do is you can open up the slides yourself. There's a link to them from my session in the Sakai virtual conference site, the Try Sakai site, so that you can see the illustrations there yourselves. And it's also possible to do a simpler workflow. I see there's a question. Can you explain what you mean by embed in the lessons tool that you mentioned earlier? Yes, absolutely. I will do a live demo in a second. So I will show you what these files look like, what the lessons tool looks like when I've worked with it and I've uploaded my files to Weblearn, to Sakai. Oh, thanks, Gabriella, for telling me that you can't see the images either there. All right, I will find a fix for that. So in terms of integrating these plain text files with Sakai, then the first thing that I do is upload the files to resources and overwrite the resources whenever I have new versions, whenever I've done some editing. So I just do that the normal way that you would upload files to resources. And if you use the kind of drag and drop method, then it will automatically overwrite your files. And then the changes will propagate throughout the lessons pages automatically as soon as the students log in the next time or as soon as they refresh the page. In the lessons tool, I embed the HTML to create the learning pathway, and then I link to slides such as this slideshow and PDFs of the detailed activity instructions. And in the tests tool, I've been trying out Dr. Charles Severance's gift to QTI converter, and there's a link to that in the slides. And then, so you can create questions, different types of question formats, so multiple choice questions, true-false questions, short answer questions in plain text files, and then convert them to QTI and upload them, and they'll become a questions pool within the tests and quizzes tool. I see there are no more questions, so I will continue to show you what it actually looks like in Weblearn. Can you confirm that you can now see a different screen? So I've switched to Weblearn, Oxford Sakai. Yep, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so this is a course that I taught just a couple of months ago, Essential Programming with Python. This first block that you can see here is it's an example of the HTML file based on plain text that is embedded within lessons. So you can see that the formatting doesn't match the ordinary lessons, and this is something that I want to follow up with, because there are times when I've uploaded it and the lesson CSS has been applied, and then there are times like this one where I couldn't manage to get the lesson CSS to apply. So I don't know whether that is a bug within Weblearn or whether that's something that I just need to do it in a particular way. So this is kind of it's all still quite experimental, and there's still some little things that I need to fix, as well as some bigger picture ideas that I have for the future. But if we click on one of the lessons subpages, so go into what the students are doing on Monday morning. So you can see the first thing on Monday morning, they have a summary, and this is an example of the HTML that is linked to from the resources page. So if they click on that, they get the whole summary. The reason that I did it this way, rather than having the summary embedded here at the top of the page, was because for some reason in at least Oxford's instance of Sakai, every time you embedded an HTML like this, you would end up with a large area underneath of blank text, and it just meant that everything else was pushed off the bottom of the page, and the students would have had to realize they needed to scroll down to find the other activities. So that again is a bug that I need to pin down and to ask someone to look into for me. And then I'm using a lessons question here. I don't know how many of you are familiar with lessons, but it's a really great way to just get a little bit of instant feedback, either to give you an idea of where the students are. So such as this, I asked them to tell me what 3 words best describe how they feel about starting this course. And that lets me know what the emotional mood is of the course. And it gives me some ideas about what kind of spread of experience and what kind of anxiety or optimism there might be amongst the group. And then I've got links here within the lessons page. So for example, this is the course introduction slideshow. So you can see the style is the same as what I've been using in my presentation for the virtual conference here. So they have all of the resources here, and I teach from this site when I run my courses. So I will log myself into Sakai and I will launch the slides from here so that I know that what I'm looking at is exactly what the students are looking at as well. And that's actually how I launched the slideshow today from within the Try Sakai site. So it might be something about the fact that I did that from a forum and it didn't like the image linking. So I maybe try uploading the slides as just a link within the lessons in the Try Sakai site, see if that fixes the problem. So I see that Gabriella has asked, are my slides linked to a CSS? So yes, they are. They're slides that are created using Remark JavaScript. So what you do is you wrap the markdown text that you've created, the plain text you've created, within an HTML header and footer. And that HTML header and footer have links to a style sheet online, or you can also package the slides so that they contain all of the fonts and the style sheet information within the slides themselves. So if I'm just going to nip to another screen, which you probably can't see, so I'll drag a tab over if necessary. I'm just going to see if it's possible to open up that HTML file in a text editor. The other thing I can do maybe is look at the page source. Yeah. So here you can see that this is the markdown. So it's not highlighting in the way that I wanted to show you in the image that I had. But essentially, if you want to do a heading, then you preface it with 1 hash. And if you want to do a second level heading, you preface it with 2 hashes. You can use italics by single star around your phrase. You can use bullet point lists here. And you can also, within a slideshow, give yourself comments that you can see as a presenter, but that aren't immediately visible to the student. So here's below the 3 question marks, that's an example there. So you can look at that within presenter view. But wrapped on either side of that is the HTML header that tells the slideshow where to get the fonts from, and the footer, which has a link down to Remark.js, which is where how the slideshow, how the plain text is packaged into these slides, rather than just appearing like this as raw HTML. And I'm just trying to find the Zoom window again now. It always moves when I change what I'm looking at. Okay, the chat window has disappeared. So I'm temporarily going to stop sharing so that I can try and find it again. Ah, here we go. There's a link. Cool. So I can see there's another question from Gabriella. Do I store all of the material online in a server or drive? So when I'm writing the plain text files, I store it locally on my laptop. but I have that linked to a GitHub repository so that I can use Git to upload to that repository online and then access it from anywhere that has an internet connection. So I actually edit files on both of my laptops at the moment because I'm still transitioning to my new one. And then I keep the files up to date on Sakai as well. Does that answer your question? Cool, thanks. So you can see I also, within the lessons tool, have a link to a skills audit that I ask students to do at the beginning of the course. So this is in the surveys tool. And I'm working on a way to look at how to integrate plain text questions with the surveys tool, because I think the surveys tool is fantastic in the way that it packages questions and shows them to the students, gathers all the information up, but it is really clunky to write the questions, to reorder them, to edit them, and to redeploy them. So I would like to see if there's an easier way for me to keep the questions on my local machine and then upload a list of questions to surveys from a plain text file. But that's a work in progress at the moment. Okay, so I'll switch back to the slides now. Does anyone have any more questions while I've got the WebLearn site, the Sakai site open? Okay, so I'll move on. So I've already discussed some of the unsolved problems. So I need to look into how to get the embedded text within lessons to take on the CSS of lessons, so that it's not an abrupt change visually, but that it's just is packaged a part of lessons and the students can't actually tell that it's not part of lessons and written natively within lessons. With the test questions, the gift format isn't automatically supported by Sakai. The QTI converter that Charles Severance has written is really useful, but it has limitations in the number of different question types that it can convert. So I think there's definitely room for more development there. And that's something I will ask him about when he gets time to answer a question. Many people demanding his time. And one of the things I think about as well is sometimes this feels like a retrograde step. You know, there's so much functionality in Sakai. There's so much functionality that's growing and being added on in Sakai. So is what I'm doing turning my back on that new growth and development? So using the plain text approach, I'm not exploiting the links to the other Sakai tools from within lessons. That I have still to do the old way in lessons. And it's harder to make these connections, use the lessons questions, develop the subpages. So what I'm thinking is that I really enjoy this new workflow. I think there's a lot of scope for it. Whilst it seems really old school to go back to plain text, it makes me much more flexible in which VLE I deploy my learning materials in. And that could be because I shift institutions. It could be because my institution changes what VLE they use. It could be because I want to deliver a MOOC, or I want to deliver a course that is purely online, open for anyone, kind of people can study whenever they want. So I think that there's real scope for this approach to meld in better with the next generation digital learning environment. So I don't know how many of you have thought much about NGDLE, but it's something that's very much on my mind at the moment. And there's lots of discussions going on at the moment within the Sakai community. There are more people becoming aware of the next generation digital learning environment and what that might mean for Sakai. So what I would advocate is that Sakai tools give people more flexibility in how you create your learning materials, that find ways in which you can develop a workflow that suits you, but that still integrates really smoothly with Sakai and still makes the most of all of Sakai's wonderful capability. So for example, I would like to be able to rather than manually pointing and clicking to set test start and end dates and to set which list of participants I want to use, I want to be able to put a few tags in my plain text file that just say start date, end date, and have those picked up by the tests tool and automatically deploy the test according to those. And I also think that it's really important that all of these tools continue to be able to talk to each other. So Sakai tools to talk internally with each other. And if Sakai is deployed as an app store, or if there are other app stores, that those tools also talk with Sakai and share information with each other, because that's really important to keep enabling in the next generation digital learning environment this great strength that we're beginning to really see the potential of in Sakai in terms of the lessons tool being able to bring in activities within all the other tools. So what am I thinking about for the future? I'm really keen to look at Tsugi or Kaseo, these tools that Dr. Charles Severance is developing with colleagues, and think about deploying courses outside of ELE or bringing those courses in using Tsugi to act as an app store. And there were some brilliant talks earlier today about Tsugi and app stores, and I know that Dr. Chuck is going to be talking about that later on today as well. So I'm wondering, how can I integrate more interactive learning activities by setting the framework within plain text, uploading that, but then letting the students loose on it to do whatever they want to do, so that they can really kind of have different ways of experiencing the learning materials. So I'm wondering whether it's possible to maybe integrate this with H5P. And I see there's a question from Nicola at UCT, why not just integrate with Google Docs? That is a really good question, Nicola, and I think that's the approach that most people would choose. And that was one of my suggestions. So on one of the schematics that unfortunately didn't show up, then the simpler workflow, I suggested that you use Google Docs or Dropbox for collaborative authoring, but also you can use them for interactive and collaborative work for the students. The reason that I choose not to do that is because I am hesitant about using software that isn't open source. If there are commercial companies who are developing and giving you access to software, it's usually because they want something back from you. And whilst I think it's fine for me to make a decision to use those tools, I don't think it's fine for me to require my students to also use those tools. I think they have the right to make their own decisions about the privacy of their data and their online activities. So I'm one of those people who doesn't really trust Google and would rather use open source tools where I can, so that I know that my students' privacy is not being compromised in any way, either now or in the future. I hope that answers your question, and I know that's not the answer that a lot of people would give. So I'm also really keen to look at different ways of embedding collaborative learning activities in tools that really encourage the use of plain text. So things like Etherpad for group authoring, EtherCalc for data sharing, and FreePlane, and combined with Mind42 for mind mapping. And if you're curious about any of those tools, if you don't already know about them, then click on the links in the presentation and that will take you to them. Or feel free to drop me an email, and I'll just put my email in the chat room now. So I'm also keen to learn a little bit more about Common Cartridge. It's something I don't know very much about, and I'm wondering whether it's a method to kind of wrap up all of these connections to different tools, or a different way to create a learning pathway. But I'm aware that in my ignorance, it might be something that is going to become obsolete. Maybe there's a better way of doing it. So I would like to kind of open up to the floor. If anyone knows a better way of doing what I've been doing, then I'm very keen to hear it. So I'd like to say thank you very much for listening. It's time I get close to wrapping up this talk. I've left resources for this talk on the Sakai Virtual Conference session page, and I will upload a version which definitely has the illustrations on it. And finally, does anyone have any more questions? What do you think about this workflow? Do you think there's anything interesting in it? Do you have any reservations about it? There's quite a silence going on here. Either I've completely bewildered you, or you're thinking about something else, or maybe just thinking really hard about a question. You're very welcome to email me if anything occurs to you. So Gabriella says, does a screen reader read my content in the page sequence? Is my material accessible? That is a really good question. I need to check that. Thanks for alerting me to that. Accessibility is something that I haven't thought enough about so far. I would assume that because the files are all, pretty much all HTML files, and because if you ignore the HTML header and footer, everything is in plain text, that a screen reader would be able to read it. But it sounds like you might know more about that than me. Do you know how a screen reader would work with plain text, with HTML? You're very welcome to put your mic on if you want to answer that question. That's fine. Okay, so Gabriella answers, sometimes it doesn't work well when it's embedded. That's really useful information. Thank you. I will look into that and see how it works. Okay, cool. Well, that's good to know. That's good to know. Yeah, those are really good questions. And I will look into that because that is definitely an important thing that I need to check out. Thank you. Okay, so I think that we've reached the end of time for this session. Thank you for attending. You're very welcome to email me if you've got any further questions, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Sakai Virtual Conference. Thank you.